Good evening. My name is Thurman Greco, and the name of this program is Let's Live, and it's coming to you from Channel 23 in Woodstock, our public access television, and from YouTube as well. And I am very excited about our guest this evening, who is a writer, as you can see from the selection of books in front. It's called To March or to Marry by Violet Snow. And I'd like to start, Violet, by asking you to introduce yourselves to us.
Okay, I'm a writer, obviously, and I'm a journalist. I wrote for the Woodstock Times for 17 years, and now I'm starting to do a little bit again for Hudson Valley One, but I've kind of shifted most of my attention to presenting this book, which is very exciting to me. It's about suffrage and women's clubs in the early 1900s. And it's kind of given me a whole new way of interacting with the world, which is very exciting.
Well, now you did give me one clue. You told me that you did a memoir several years ago.
Yeah, well, I've been writing books for a long time. There's only two that have actually made it into print. And I self-published a short memoir about 10 years ago when I was 22. I was traveling around India by myself. And there was a period where I was trying to practice meditation, and I was looking for a boyfriend, and neither of those endeavors was going very well. And I got really depressed, and one day I had the brilliant idea that I was going to give away my money and become a sadhu, a wandering spiritual beggar, it's a very strong tradition in India. So, and I'd heard of a couple of Westerners doing it, and so I decided that's what I needed to go to the next level. So for 6 weeks, I walked around India, and that's what the book is about.
Wow. How long did it take you to write that book?
It's hard to say. Immediately after I gave up and took a train back to Delhi and called my parents to send me money, I came down with hepatitis. So while I was sick, I started writing because I didn't have anything else to do, really. And that, then that sat for a while, and then, a couple of years later, I worked on it some more and then put it away. And then a few years later, I worked on it some more, so it didn't really make it into print for many years. But then at some point, self-publishing came along, and I thought, it'd be nice to have something that I can give to people or sell to people. I did sell a few, but I didn't actively promote it.
And then how long did this one take?
It took me a year to write, including the research and the revisions and the writing. And I started it in February of 2019. I was watching the State of the Union address, and I noticed that all the Democratic congresswomen were sitting together, all dressed in white, in recognition of the suffragettes. And it just popped into my head to write a historical novel about suffrage. And I have a great-grandmother whose letters I started to read about 5 or 10 years ago, and her letters talk about her women's club. And I'd never heard of the women's club movement, but I started to research it, and I discovered that it was this huge movement starting in about 1868. 2 really large clubs were founded, and then it was like a snowball, like all these in towns and cities all over the country, women started these clubs, and they would they would meet together once a week or once every 2 weeks, and some of them were literary clubs, some of them were community service clubs, some were about social reform. And it was a huge movement. By 1916, 1.5 million women in the United States belonged to clubs. But it had a really strong impact because it kind of showed men that women were capable of intellectual activity. Like, women were seen as these kind of just these caretakers. That was like the feminine ideal. But in fact, women had intellectual power, and through the clubs, they learned to write papers. They would read them aloud to each other, and they learned public speaking. They learned a lot of skills that later allowed them to enter the workforce in business and in government. So it was really an important movement, although to the suffragettes it was kind of tame, because the suffragettes were out there marching and protesting and getting arrested, and so both are in the book because it just seemed to me that when the women's marches began after Donald Trump was elected president, there was a lot of conflict within this movement. And, some women were saying, oh, it's too soon to have a march. It's not politically a good idea. And then the second year there was, racial conflict, and the black women started their own group because they felt like they weren't being acknowledged and allowed enough power in the movement. And then people would criticize it. Well, why aren't women more united? But that's how a movement works. There's a lot of different opinions and ideas, and you need all these different things happening at the same time to make something work. So that was part of my idea behind the novel, is to show these two strands of early feminism and how they kind of conflicted, but ultimately they had the same goal and they supported each other.
I think I want to go back. I really want to get into this, but before we get into this, I want to go back to the beginning, because I asked you how long it took for you to do the memoir, and you said about 10 years. And then you said this one took about a year. And I do realize that you do have a career in which you wrote. But I also see this phenomenon in which the first book takes a long time. And then after that, it's like it's like to do the memoir and do the book takes a different mental stream than the newspaper.
Oh, well, certainly. But I've written lots of other books. They just haven't been published.
They just haven't been published. But I was so once you started on this one, you went with it.
Well, this one, so the books that I've written are all novels. A couple of them are mystery novels. Some of them are about families. Some of them, but self-publishing is kind of daunting because, how are you going to market a novel on your own? It's just I don't know how to do it. But this book, although it's a novel, it has historical issues that are relevant today. And that's what gave me the courage to just go, when I thought of it, when I had the idea for it, I thought, well, this is so relevant. Here there's women dressed like suffragists in the Congress. People are thinking about these issues right now, the Me Too movement. There's so many things happening, women being elected vice president, women running for president. It just seemed like a time where we need to look back and look at the early women's movement and take inspiration from it and learn lessons from it and not think we all have to be perfectly united, but understand what goes into a movement and making change. So that's what gave me the courage after I tried lots of agents. Some of them, people seem to like the idea of it, and quite a few agents asked to look at it, but no one went for it. And meanwhile, I had these 2 articles about to come out that were related to the book. And I thought, I shouldn't waste that. I should go ahead and self-publish, which only takes like 2 months, and take advantage of this situation. And, at first I felt like, oh, I'm giving up. No, but then I felt like, no, I'm taking control. I want this book to come out now. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to market it myself. And it's been really exciting to do. I've got a couple conventions booked, the vendors tables at 2 women's club conventions coming up in the fall. I was asked by the Daughters of the American Revolution, the New York City chapter, the Peter Minuit chapter. They asked me to speak to them after reading one of my articles about my great-grandmother and her women's club. And so it's just exciting. Like, I have this whole new way of interacting with the world, and I feel like I really have something of interest to people. I mean, sure, novels are interesting, but, how do you, novels about families, like, how do you convince someone to read that? I don't know how to do it. But this, people are like, oh, that sounds interesting.
Well, I think the important thing is, and you have really gotten to the heart of the matter, and what you got to was that when you self-publish, you are in control. And once you go to a publisher, you're not in control.
Right.
And unless you are going to sell $1 million worth of books and you're 30 years old, you're not going to get anybody who's working with you from the publisher who has any, you're going to get an intern. Is what you're going to
Right.
and you're going to have to rely on this person's opinion.
Mm.
I truly believe, and I know that I do not see myself as a writer, but when I started writing books, and I was going down to Gotham every week to try to figure out how do you put one word after another one, they kept talking about the publisher, and I realized that the publishing houses don't want me. They don't. First of all, I'm not going to sell that many books. Second of all, I'm not somebody that they can take and train and move along. Mm. You see, this is the difference. You are in control. Mm. And when you're in control, you know where you want to go. And so you are now working things that you want to work. And you're telling your story to people that you want to hear it.
Yeah, which is half the country is
Right.
women.
Right.
I have a pretty big
Right.
audience.
Yes, that's wonderful. And have you applied? Now you said you've done a reading at Golden Notebook.
Right.
Have you applied? You said you've been down to Millbrook. Did you do a reading down there?
No, it was just a
They give you
table
a
at the
table.
farmer's market through the bookstore there.
Yeah.
But-
Have you applied for any other readings anywhere? Is that something that's on? I'm just trying to figure out. Is that something that's on your radar screen?
I'm going to speak to the Wallkill Women's Club
Go girl.
in, I think it's late September, maybe it's October, maybe it's November. Anyway, I'm booked there. I mean, I'm really, the book was published in June, but I'm really just getting rolling, I mean, there's just so much you can do. There's so much to do, and I have to have a life besides that. So, but it's moving along. It's moving along. Now I've applied to the National Women's Hall of Fame at Seneca Falls, but they're getting ready for their induction ceremony. So they said, when that's over, they'll start looking at our programs, for after that. So, but they seemed interested, and I'm working a lot of angles.
And do you have like a list of places that you're contacting?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, my hope is with these women's club conventions, I'll reach a lot of women because a whole lot of different clubs will be there. At both, one is Middle Atlantic and one is New England. But also, I'm hoping that some of them, the clubs, will want to book me for their clubs, I can speak either by Zoom or in person. They're not too far away. So that's part of the strategy.
Have you contacted the National Federation of Women?
I didn't know there was a National Federation of Women. There's a Federation of Women's Clubs, but I don't know about the National Federation of Women.
When I got to, well, of course, this ages me, but when I got to be, 22 or 23, out of college, had a couple of kids, somebody said, now look, it's time for you to join the National Federation of Women. And then when I got ready to move to Venezuela, she said, now look, it's time for you to take it down to Venezuela and get a chapter going. And I had these little toddlers and of course didn't do anything. But it's our personality and this is how we move it. So how did you write this book?
Well, how did I write the book? That's a good question. So, as I said, it starts with my great-grandmother. And this right here is my great-grandmother. I don't know if you can see that. But
so the photograph is...
The photograph is my great-grandmother's women's club.
Wow.
And she is right there in the middle. There's a little X on her chest.
That puts a lot of punch in that book, in that cover.
Right. And when she was writing to her mother just after her first child was born, she wrote about her daughter, my grandmother, and all the cute little things she did, and she wrote about household crises and what her husband was doing, and almost every letter says something about her women's club.
Oh, did it?
Either something about the meetings or something about her friends from the club, although she called them all Mrs., right? Mrs. Hogue, Mrs. Varian, Mrs. Caterson.
Really?
Yes. But she saw them every week and she would say, I have to do some reading. I'm going to do a paper on Napoleon III. So I have a lot of reading to do this week. My paper's due week after next. And there was just so much in the letters about the club. It was clear it was really an important part of her life.
How did you get these letters?
Mary Wingebach, my great-grandmother, saved a lot of things. She saved letters, diaries, her children's report cards. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. And they were passed down through her daughter, my grandmother, to my grandmother had two children, both girls. So my mother had a lot of stuff, and my aunt had a lot of stuff. And then after my aunt died, a whole box of stuff ended up in my mother's house, but she never looked in it. And then a couple of years ago, I was visiting my mom, and she said, I found this box. You want to take a look at it? And we started looking through it, and there were all these letters, and they're fascinating. And yeah, the Women's Club comes up. There was also a letter printed on the Federation of Women's Clubs of New York City letterhead. It was announcing their convention at the Hotel Astor.
Wow.
And there was on the letterhead, it had the names of directors for each of the boroughs of New York. And the director for the borough of the Bronx was Mrs. August Wingebach, my great-grandmother. So she was really active and engaged in her life in the club.
Oh, that's wonderful. So how much of this is history and how much of this is novel?
Well, I mean, well, that's a good question. So I did a lot of research. I researched women's clubs, and I researched the suffrage movement. And there were a lot of really educated women in the suffrage movement, so there's a lot of documentation, women writing memoirs about their activities in the movement. So a lot of that stuff went straight into the novel. I mean, there are two main characters. Abby is based on my great-grandmother, and she is, very similar, and a lot of details from the letters, not just about the clubs, but about her life and her children. A lot of those details made it into the book. But obviously, actually, there was a point where I don't have any letters after, her second childbirth, and I'm glad I didn't have letters because I was free to invent things. So, the second half of the book, as far as Abby is concerned, is really fictional.
And
but
how many children did she have in reality?
Same as in the book. And, as for the other main character, Louise, she's completely invented, but a lot of things that she does are based on what I read in the suffrage memoirs. But the plot of the book is basically that these two women meet at a women's club meeting. They both join at the same time. They become really good friends, and then circumstances in Louise's life cause her to leave the club and join the suffrage movement. And the clubs were rather conservative. I mean, they were doing something, in some sense, radical, women leaving the home to go meet every week. That was kind of daring at the time, but their attitudes were very conventional. And I mean, they felt like as wives and mothers, they had something to offer the world. It was kind of based on their role in the family. They could look out and see, we need a kindergarten, free kindergarten. We need garbage pickup. We need the streets to be clean. But basically they were kind of conservative, and they didn't like the idea of marching. Like, that was very unladylike. So what was my point? So like in the clubs, there were some clubs that were formed actually to support the suffrage movement, but there were a lot of clubs where suffrage was not discussed. It's like a rule. You didn't want to discuss something so controversial. They didn't discuss suffrage, they didn't discuss religion, and not so much politics either. But because of that, there's a tension between the suffrage movement and the women's club movement. So in the book, it creates a rift between the two characters. But they still care about each other, and they keep trying to get back together and sort of bouncing apart. And so that's kind of the basic plot of the book. So, that's made up. I mean, I don't know that my great-grandmother had a friend who was a suffragist. I kind of doubt it, actually. But that's how it works in the novel. And that allows me to bring in all sorts of historical information, details about people's lives, automobiles, bicycles, what it was like in 1912 to ride a bicycle in the Bronx, all sorts of interesting things. So some of them are factual, and everything I made up is I looked everything up, like, would they have electricity in their house or not? That was like a big thing. I was like, it's 1912. Well, there is a Con Edison plant already in Manhattan, but in the Bronx, are they going to have electricity? I mean, some of these things were really hard to figure out. And what I decided was, if they were fairly wealthy, yes, they would have electricity. But as middle class people, probably not. So, I really went into, there's a lot of facts in the book, even though the story itself is novelistic.
Did she talk to you?
While I was writing the book?
Yes.
Well, I had written another book about her, and she talked to me during that book, but not so much during this book.
Do you know why?
No, I don't know why. Because I didn't need her. I kind of knew what I was doing.
Okay.
The other book, I was really unsure, and I was trying to write in her. I was trying to write the letters. Her letters don't talk about her emotions. I mean, people in their letters, they didn't do that. And I wanted to read between the lines. So I wrote the letters I thought she would have written if she had felt freer to express her emotions. I started writing those letters. And then I started writing letters to her in response. Like, her letters were to her cousin. I was writing to her, like, I'm sorry, I hope this is okay. I know, I think, I have a feeling this is what was really going on, although you never quite said it. And then one morning I woke up and I heard this voice in my head, who are you and why are you bothering me? And then we started having a dialogue, and I would write to her and she would write back to me, and it was really fun.
Yeah, I wrote, when I wrote the book about the food pantry, I heard from my grandmother.
Wow, what did she say?
She told me, write this. Yeah, and then you do this, and then you do this. Because I wasn't a writer. I mean, somebody had to tell me what to do, and so she did.
Wow,
and that
that's
sounds
great.
like what happened with you. You needed some guidance.
Yeah.
And so she came forth.
Yeah.
And so now you don't need the guidance anymore. So she's sitting back and enjoying it, and you were able to do the work.
I hope she's enjoying it. I've apologized to her many times. Like, I know these particular things didn't really happen to you, but they could have. And I think your response is completely in character. And I hope you're not offended, and I hope you appreciate that women will learn from this and be moved by it. And so, yeah, I've talked to her about it.
Do you think that when you talked to her and you said, I hope, that if her response had been no, don't you think you would have heard it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So you got the go-ahead.
Yeah, I never felt that she would, I was a little nervous about it, but I never got the feeling that she would have been upset with me. Also, we had worked it out in the other book, like, she was a little annoyed at first, and then we kind of like, she said, I wouldn't have complained like that. And I was like, okay, I'm sorry, I just thought,
Oh, I think that's beautiful.
We worked it out. By the end, she was okay with me.
So now, this has been out, 3 months?
Yeah. Yeah.
So is there another one coming?
I was just thinking about that today. When I finished the book, I started doing some research on what happened after women got the vote. And it was kind of interesting. I read a really interesting book about it was actually mostly about the the settlement house movement, which people don't realize there were a lot of strands to the women's movement in the early 1900s. I mean, there was suffrage, there was women's clubs, there was the settlement houses, which were completely female. There was the birth control movement, which is involved in the book. So I started to do some research, and it was kind of interesting, but I got sidetracked, and now I've written another book. It's a kind of spiritual novel, and I think I have to finish that. But I was thinking that I might want to go on to talk about what happened after women got the vote, because there were a lot of changes.
Absolutely, and nobody has discussed them.
Yeah.
It's just all, hey, something else totally. It's like they've been overlooked.
Yeah.
And those changes are essential.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, women pretty much structured the New Deal. FDR's New Deal. It all came, there was already a structure in place of government agencies that were responding to the poverty that capitalism brought about in the Industrial Revolution. And it was all staffed by women, and, then there were changes. Men realized, we could get jobs in here too. But basically, women had a really important impact on government at that point.
Well, that's a huge thing.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting to write about. I just, I needed a little break.
Well, if you continue on with this, how do you see yourself going forward with this book?
Well, I would take the two main characters and try to picture what would happen to them, after 1920, after women have the vote. I mean, what really interests me is trying to look at the relationships between men and women, and I'm not exactly sure how to do this, but I think that, women have a lot more rights in a lot of ways, and the second wave feminism of the 60s and 70s had a really profound impact, but it sort of showed how much farther there was to go in terms of how women and men relate to each other. And I remember reading Betty Friedan and thinking, wow, I never thought of those things.
Right.
I was in my 20s and I was like, whoa, I have to think about this. And, and looking at my relationships with men and my daughter's relationships with men and realizing how much farther, there's so much on an interpersonal level that still needs to happen before women can really take their power, really take control and take charge and be really equal to men. It's, whatever, of course now we're having these problems about, birth control and abortion. Those, never mind that problem. But, in terms of political status and personal status, they haven't quite kept pace. And I was trying to think of some way that I could trace how women's relationship to men have changed and still need to change, but I haven't quite figured out how to do that. That's one of my ideas.
Well, I'm very, very sensitive to that because I've been spending the last few days taking a class, and I have been completely blown away by listening to young women and realizing that it is our relationship to men, it is our relationship to other women, it's our relationship with ourselves, within ourselves.
Right.
And it's just gone zoom, and I'm not sure that women are keeping up. Personally, they're not coming forth with all of the changes that are taking place. And this transgender, that we think about people thinking about their children as being transgender throws a parent into hysterics. And they're thinking about, mastectomies and, all of those things. And I don't think young people are thinking about that at all. I don't think young women are. I think it's a completely spiritual thing going beyond. And I don't think anybody has a clue. It is totally, I'm usually very, very talkative. I just have been spending the last few days not saying a word. I've been listening to what, women don't, I'm not sure that young women are grasping what's in their hands now.
I don't know. I don't talk to that many young women. I talk to my daughter, who's 29, and I watched her go through a number of really difficult relationships with men and thinking, how come I didn't teach her better? Why doesn't she have more self-esteem? And now she's come through it and is, she's very involved in feminism. She's getting a PhD and writing a thesis that's about feminism. I mean, I'm seeing her move into much more power in her relationships, and I think each generation does go a little farther than the one before in terms of progress, and it takes a while for it to become clear. I mean, I feel like she at 29 is ahead of where I was at 39. You know, like I can see that some progress is being made, but it's hard to understand. I mean, maybe this book will help people, who knows. Maybe it will help young women see all the challenges that we faced and at this point in time, and how much more farther there is to go, but how much opportunity they have in the present.
Well, but for me, this book, I can hardly wait to start reading it, but we have this, plus we have the next generation or the next volume. This is all ground that I haven't read anything about historically, and not much in the history books, truthfully. And
True.
so, this is all, and then now we're talking about Betty Friedan, and now it's just, I don't know, I'm the whole new world, but we do have to, it's marching on, and we have to come on to it. And if no one writes about it, how are we going to come into it if we don't read it? What is the value? I guess maybe I'm placing too much value on the written word and the story.
Well, we need to read, we need to write, we need to talk.
Absolutely.
We need all those things. We
Yes.
need to meet in groups. We need to work alone. We need to do all those things.
It's a maturing
Yeah.
of the human being.
Yeah.
You
It
know,
is.
and this is where, and I feel like we're at a point that maybe we wouldn't have been if we had not had the pandemic. If we hadn't, so many of us locked ourselves in solitude somewhere, and had to look in the mirror and see ourselves, and we had to think. And so I'm wondering if maybe, did she have the solitude? Did she have the time to think? Was she even encouraged?
Well, I think that in her women's club, she had a chance to talk to other women about issues. I don't know if she did. I mean, they were a literary group, at least at the time when she was writing letters to her mother. On the other hand, she got very involved in it, and I think a lot of literary groups did move on to social reform, and I like to think her group might have done that. I think after her kids grew up, she probably did have a lot of time to think. Although actually she went back to work.
Oh, did she really?
She did. Her parents divorced when she was 14. This was
my
not
goodness.
very common in the 1880s, but her father was a Civil War veteran, and he had been in Andersonville prison, which was pretty horrific Confederate prison camp. And when he started beating his wife, the family attributed it to war trauma, especially from the camp. But the family helped her get a divorce. They were worried about her safety. So Mary's parents divorced. She taught herself shorthand and typewriting. It wasn't called typing in those days, it was typewriting. And she became a secretary to a publisher in Topeka, Kansas. And then she went at the age of 20. She was an unusual person, actually. At the age of 20, she went to Wales, because her father had been born in Wales. And she went to his village And when she came back, she stayed in New York. She didn't go back to Topeka. And her mother came to New York, and her sister was already there, and they lived together. And she got a job with Dodd Mead Publishing Company. So she was in the workforce for many years. She didn't marry until she was, I think, 30, and 31 actually. And so she liked working. She liked being out in the world. And I think it must have been really difficult to suddenly be a housewife after that. And my belief is that's why she joined the women's club. It was a lifesaver for her after, working in an office and meeting famous authors, and, suddenly she's like stuck doing the laundry. I mean, it must have been a shock. So the women's club was very stimulating for her. And then after her kids grew up, she went back and got another job. She worked for an interior decorator, and like managing the office, I believe, something like that. So hopefully she had time to think, but I think she liked being busy also. She liked being out in the world.
If you have a message for this book, what is it?
It's that there are many different ways to be an activist, and there's many different ways to contribute to changing the world. Some people are going to be out on the front lines, and if that's their nature, I think that's great. Other people are going to be a little working on a different level, changing ideas just by doing things a little differently than was done in the past. And that's in some people's nature. I'm not a big activist myself. I mean, I have gone to demonstrations, and I got arrested once, but for protesting the U.S. Trident nuclear submarine base in Scotland. But that's not really that big a deal. Although it was a little shocking to be arrested. I was in jail for 2 nights, and then, but that's I'm not drawn to that kind of activity very much. But what I like to do is write. So that's my contribution. I write about these topics for the newspaper, or, now I've written a book. And I just think everyone has a way to contribute. You just have to find the right way and do it. Find the way that suits your personality.
I am coming to believe that we are not made to be activists, that we are born to be activists, that it is a genetic thing. I really am. That you can, if you don't look through a certain lens, you can be staring straight at an opportunity to display, to march, to write, do whatever, and you're not going to. If it's not there, it's not there. But I don't know whether that's even a real attitude or not. I just see people who have opportunities to be activists, and they're just not. It's not going to happen. And yet I see others who are going to be activists at the drop of a hat.
Well, certainly there are people who are going to be activists at the drop of a hat. Some people, it depends on what happens to them in their life and what kind of motivation. I mean, I don't think of myself as a big activist. My husband is more into it, so he kind of dragged me into that anti-nuclear movement. But that was okay. I was glad to do it. But after that, I kind of avoided going to demonstrations. But last summer, some friends of ours I was pretty affected by Black Lives Matter. I mean, it really moved me and made me upset. And some friends of mine wanted to have a Black Lives Matter vigil. And it didn't work out where they were going to do it. So they came to us and said, let's try to do it in Phoenicia. I live in Phoenicia. And at first I was like, oh, no, this seems kind of, I don't really want to get involved in this. But then I started to think about it, and they brought it up again, and I realized that I had connections from having written for the paper. Like if we did it in Phoenicia Park, I knew who to talk to in the town government, who to, make sure that, everything was arranged. I had all these, and then it got interesting, like I felt like I could flex my contacts, my influence. It was kind of exciting. And so I ended up, helping to organize this event, which I never thought I would do. So I don't know if it's strictly true what you're saying. I think it depends on circumstances to some extent. I mean, now that we did it once, now my husband is saying, oh, we should have like a anti-racist film club. And I'm like, all right, well, someone else can organize that. I'll go to the movies. I don't think I want to do it in the park. Nah, someone else can do that. I don't feel like doing it again. But at the time, I was really glad I did it, and it was a great event. We had several hundred people, and 200 or 300 people, and it was peaceful, and it was beautifully, my other friend organized some people to speak and sing, and it was a beautiful event, and I was happy with it, but it's not, it'd take a lot to make me do something like that again. Whereas this feels like in my nature.
This is your avenue because you write.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier that your husband is a writer.
Yes, Sparrow. He's the local poet, clown.
So you're living in the house with another writer.
That's right. I sure am.
Can you share with us how that works?
Well, he has an office at one end of the house. I have an office in a bedroom at the other end of the house. And, we email each other. And he doesn't talk until noon because that's his writing and thinking time. And so I get the whole morning to myself. We don't bother each other. And then, in the afternoon while he's doing his yoga, we hang out, talk. It works pretty well. We did that reading together at the Golden Notebook.
Oh, that was nice.
Yeah, it was really nice.
And he read his book and you read your book?
Well, we each talked first about the book, like I'm talking to you, but that's not as long. And, I talked for a while, and then I read, like, the very beginning of the book. And then we sang a suffrage song. And he got the audience to come in on the last couple choruses. And then he talked about his book, and he read from his book, and we sang a doo-wop song, because with his character, it's called the Princeton Diary, and one of his main character, is interested in doo-wop. So we learned In the Still of the Night, and he got the audience to do the shabop shabop in the background, and it was really fun.
So do you ever like go down the hall and read to him and say, what do you think about this?
Not really. Once in a while he'll send me something and he says, is the syntax right in this? Or if he writes something and I'm in it, like if he writes something, like we both write occasionally for the home improvement section of the Ulster Publishing Papers. And a lot of them are about our house and our life. And so he'll, if he's in my story or if I'm in his story, then we always is it okay if I say this about you? But no, we're not really each other's editors very much, a little bit, once in a while.
So you just kind of work together, but alongside each other, not really.
Well, like I said, we collaborate on some things, like we did this reading together, and, we're kind of promoting our books together a little bit.
So you do kind of go along together. I think it's nice,
It's great. It's great because we understand each other's need for solitude in the morning, and, we have something to talk about sometimes. I mean, he never talks about anything while he's writing it, only afterwards.
Only afterwards.
Whereas I usually talk about what I'm writing. Not always, sometimes.
Are you still writing for the newspaper? You said you're writing for the Ulster papers.
Well, I quit for 2 years, and now I'm a little bit. I'm just starting a little bit. I don't know. I was such a great job writing for the paper. I just loved it. I got to write about so many different things and meet so many people, and I knew what was going on in the town. It was really, in Woodstock and in Phoenicia, it was really interesting. But after 17 years, you get a little tired of, it gets a little repetitive. And so I quit. But now I'm being asked. I kept saying no, but now Brian Hollander started editing again, and he's such a good editor. I don't know, I really like him, so it's hard to say no.
So you are working with it some as
a
well?
A little bit, not a lot. I used to write 3 articles a week. Now it's never more, not going to do more than one. I refuse.
Okay. Well, that's nice. And it seems to me that when we first came down and observed that we had our pandemic, so much came to a screeching halt that now some of us have kind of like started anew. We have started anew. It's like a new beginning. It's not like we have resumed things. It's like we may be doing what appears to be the same thing, but it's really very different. And I get the feeling that some people are kind of in a waiting pattern, a holding pattern, trying to figure out, what the future has to bring. And of course, I don't know, but you seem to be working that way. You've resumed going, the newspaper and.
Well, no, not really. It's only very recently. Like last week, I started writing again for the newspaper, and I'm still like ambivalent about it. No, this is what I'm doing now. This like as the pandemic was ending, I was deciding to publish my book, and my life has changed a lot since the pandemic. I don't know. I've started working at a barn 4 mornings a week, feeding horses. I know my whole life has changed in the last couple months.
Do you know anybody whose life hasn't changed?
My husband's life didn't change that much,
really?
To be honest. He still does what he always does.
He still does. I think working in a barn with the horses, to me, sends an extremely spiritual message.
Well, I loved horses when I was a kid. I wanted a horse so bad. My parents finally let me take riding lessons, and I kept doing it for 12 years. But as an adult, I've always felt like, it's so frivolous, and it's too expensive, and I can't have, riding lessons cost so much now. It's like $50 an hour. And now suddenly I actually have a job. I'm actually getting paid to hang out with horses. I'm not getting to ride, but that's okay. And it's only 2 miles from my house, and it's just like, I love it. It's just, it feels like it is kind of spiritual, actually.
I think horses are extremely spiritual animals. Absolutely. Very much in tune with the environment.
They're very sensitive.
Yes.
They're prey animals, so they're very conscious of their surroundings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So have you got some places lined up where you might be giving a talk that we could hear about? You have some gigs going? Are you planning any gigs?
Oh, good point. You're good at this. Okay, so next Sunday, I'm going to be speaking at the Historical Society of Woodstock on the porch, COVID safe. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to read from the book, but I'm also going to talk about I did a little research on they're mostly in Kingston, the women's clubs and the suffrage movement in Kingston, so I'll report on that. And, there'll be books for sale, of course. And then the following Sunday, which is September 12th, I think, I'm going to be on, my friend Betty McDonald does a show at the Green Kill Gallery. It'll be like this. It'll be an interview, and I'll also read from the book. And it's live streamed on Zoom. So if you go to greenkillgallery.com, I think you can find it, and you can find the link and sign up. You have to pay at least $1 to get on the Zoom call, but I think it's worth it. And Betty's really sharp. She's a really interesting person. So she's a good interviewer. And that's all I have lined up locally. But at the moment.
Have you thought about taking your book to some of the bookstores to sell?
Yes.
I'm not saying that because you should. I'm saying that because I've interviewed other writers that are doing that. And I'm just...
Right. Well, to be honest, I feel like I need to focus my attention where the most sympathetic people are going to be. Like, I don't know that it's really worth my energy to drive around to bookstores where people don't know me. And I mean, a few people might see the book and like it and buy it. But to me, like, to go to a women's club convention where everyone's going to want this book. Well, not everyone, but if 10% of them want this book, that's a lot of people. Whereas bookstores seem a little haphazard to me. What a lot of people are telling me that I should market it to women's studies departments at colleges and to high schools, which I actually started doing and then realized you can't do that in the summer. I have to start again in October. But that's what I am really hoping, that I can get it into schools, because it's a really, the information for young women is, I mean, I think it's inspiring, and they need to know that this was in their past. As they start to move forward, it's really useful information for young women.
I definitely agree with exclamation points that women are there's just so much that we're missing, for example, in the 1800s, I know that there were, we're down to 3 minutes. I know that there were things done by women in this country, and the husbands and brothers and fathers got the credit. I just know that.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, it still happens. What do you mean?
Yeah, but nobody discusses it.
Yeah.
At all. Yeah. And Ellen just said we're down to 3 minutes. So I would like to, first of all, if somebody wants your book, how are they going to get it?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, you can go on my website,
okay,
violetsnowwriter.com.
Okay.
There's a link there to order it from the internet. Or you can email me and come by my house and I'll sell you a copy. I've got lots of them in my garage. So I'm at violetsnow77@gmail.com.
I love that you're selling your book through your website and through your own email. I really think, because I sell mine on my website, when people buy something from your website, they have a connection to you, which is not the same as if they buy it from someone else, you know?
Well, ultimately, they are going to another website to buy it. It's not directly from me, but I'm not quite set up that way, but I have to think about that. Maybe I should be.
Okay. Well, we are running out of time. Can you give people your website one more time before Ellen pulls the plug on us?
Okay. It's violetsnowwriter.com. And my email address is on the website, violetsnow77@gmail.
Thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating hour. I have about 1,000 more questions, but we ran out of time.
We'll have to have tea.